century after century of civilization after civilization, and you end up having a mound, like you see in Megiddo, which is one of the oldest. And so what we're looking at is the Tel is then a civilization that's built on another civilization that's built on another one. And so Tel Dan, in that location, is right there. Now, Dan itself is at the entrance or the beginning of the Jordan River. Gorgeous area. Initially, our tour guide told us that where they first settled, the tribe of Dan in that region, they didn't like it. There wasn't enough water. And when they came into this region, they found this is exactly what they wanted. And so they moved their settlement just to this area and called it Dan. So a large stream, it feeds the large source of the Jordan River. Now back up just a couple slides so you can see this again. You see the river-like moving on down through Lake Huldah, and then after that, Jordan River that moves on down to the Dead Sea. Okay? So you have rivers in certain areas, which is something that they desperately need, and then they have regions where it's just very fruitful and very nice looking. The tribe of Dan is described in Joshua 19, and their distribution that's being talked about to the different tribes when they're moving into the promised land. Remember now that there's different sections for different tribes. And so in Joshua 19, look at verses 40. Let's see here. Yes. It says that the seventh lot came out from the tribe of the children of Dan according to their families. And the territory of their inheritance was Zorah, Eshtaol, Shemesh, and some other names that I couldn't pronounce perfectly, so I'm going to skip over them. And as it goes through all that, then, verse 47, the border of the children of Dan went beyond these because the children of Dan went up to fight against Leshem and took it, and they struck it with the edge of the sword and took possession of it and dwelt in it, and they called Leshem Dan, after the name of Dan their father. So this is their area. It used to be called something else, but in the time of Joshua, as they're beginning to conquer these areas now, you have the idea of the word Dan coming out. And so this is why it's called that. Now, we're going to look at what is actually in that area. The area of Dan has a settlement when Joshua moves in with his conquerors. This is the city wall where Joshua came, or at least possibly came to see it. I have to put that in there because we're not sure. Absolutely, there's no definite markers, but this location is in Dan. There's no other that has been found or excavated. So it's the front entrance of the city. Now Genesis 14 makes mention of the word Dan. So I'm going to stop and I'm going to back up to that. I say back up, it's first book in the Bible, and it's also historically backtracking to Genesis 14. This is regarding Lot during the time of Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot is living in that region, and there's some kings that are moving about and conquering lands. And verse 11 says, they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all the provisions and went their way, and they also took Lot, reading now verse 12, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. Then one who escaped came, and he told Abram, the Hebrew, for they dwelt in the terebinth trees in Mamre, the Amorite, and the brother Eshcol, etc. Okay, verse 14. Now, when Abram heard that his brother's son, was taken captive, he armed 318 trained servants who were born in his house and went in pursuit as far as Dan. Now, you've read that probably a few times, that you knew about Abraham going to rescue Lot. Had you ever noticed that he went as far as Dan to go get him? Have you ever noticed that Abram, as we're picturing some guy with this long robe and this white beard, almost a glow around his face, not quite like Moses who went up in God's presence, but he's a holy man, all of a sudden has 300, is that what it says here in verse 14? 318 trained servants. He's got an army. That this guy is a holy man of God, but he's also a leader of an army. Now, here's a couple things to think about. Number one, it's as likely this is the gate that Abram came to. There is no other settlement. And this is the oldest portion that goes back to the 17 to 1800s BC. And so this is during the Middle Bronze era as far as archaeology is concerned. So you're looking at the front section that's been sealed off, where Abraham came and went as far as Dan to rescue Lot, and that's where he got him. Does that raise any questions for you? Does that seem kind of interesting? Yeah. Now it raises a question for me to start with. Because in Joshua chapter 14, the tribe of Dan settles in Canaan and then calls it Dan. Back before that time, Abraham lived, and he goes as far as Dan, which seems a little incongruent that way back when, before Dan existed, Abram is out pursuing somebody and going as far as a city called Dan. Is there another city? Think about it from this perspective. Who's writing the book? Genesis and also all the way up to Joshua before that time. Who pens Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy? Moses. Moses is writing of what went on beforehand. When he writes in Genesis 1 about the creation, it wasn't that he sat down and saw everything and wrote down what it said. He's told by God what happened, and he writes those things. And when Moses hears the story about Abram and Isaac and Jacob and all those things, he's hearing from God, and he pens by inspiration what took place. Although he didn't live then, he can categorize this location, that location, with reference to present names, although he's writing historically about what was there. So he writes accurately about what took place, but he gives it titles and of known names in his day and time. And so the city's called Dan, and Dan is where Abram actually goes in pursuit of getting Lot, his nephew, and his family back, and his goods, etc., back. And so here's what Abram faces. An aerial view, and I don't think you can read what's mentioned in this text here. If you're up close, maybe so. Down in the lower left-hand corner there, it says it's a schematic view of the Middle Bronze Age towns, of the layout of the town. And so somewhere around 1700 BC, and then there's an E after that, which is a reference, or at least an effort by dating experts to try to eliminate the concept of Christianity. And so BCE stands for what, Pat? Before the common era, rather than before Christ. They want to eliminate Christ from the dating pattern. Stands for the same era, but they give it a little different designation. So move it up a little closer, and you can see a better section here of this right up overhead. This is the entrance where Abram had to go. You saw the picture that we saw just a few minutes ago. Back it up so you can see it again. This is what it looked like just a few months ago when we were there. Took this picture, and this is where he steps up, leads straight up into that era, into that city. The exterior entry archway is in mud brick, dated to the Middle Bronze Age. Their date is 1700. Some are saying 1700 to 1900 years before, giving it a little bit older date for Abram's time. Beyond the central archway, then the interior archway, which opened to the road to the town below. So there's how the thing probably looked when you're looking at it, a diagram with 3D view to it. That these small little bronze-looking things here are like human beings that are coming up to the gate. They get into the gate. You can see from the top side that as soon as they walk in the gate, they're exposed. The gateway has the doorways inside it where people can attack them from down below and from up above, set up for protection for the city. Once they get past all of that, then you can get into the city. But this is what it looks like today. And this is where Abram went. That blows my mind. We're looking at 2,000 years ago to the time of Christ, and you back up another 1,700 or 18 or 1,900 years to the time of Abram. And that place is still standing. Obviously, excavations and all cleared away the debris, and they're still working on what's there, very carefully going through the area. So you go around the side to find your way in the entrance because they've not disturbed the actual structure to get into it. So a roadway leads into Tel Dan. It's one of the largest ancient tells, that's, those mounds, in Israel. In 1 Kings 12, 28 to 30, there's a discussion about Jeroboam, one of the kings that came much later than that, who built golden calves and sent them in different places, and Dan was one of the locations that he sent this. The street that you're looking at here in front of you, with the stoneware and all, likely is dating back at least to the 1st century, if not previous to that. One of the things that archaeologists look at in trying to determine age is the stones and what went on in different areas. Now, usually, your larger stones indicate an earlier time period. Smaller stones seem to indicate a later time period. If you're looking at the debris here, you're finding the larger stones up above and the smaller ones down below. But remember that when the civilizations come in and they rebuild roads and rebuild walls alongside of the roads, that they use what's been torn down in times past. And so they get the stones from the nearby area rather than going off and finding new ones, of course. And so they could actually build on top of one set of stones with the set of the older ones that they found in the area nearby. And so you have the reverse of what it looks like there as far as transposed, changed, to indicate that there's civilizations that have gone back and rebuilt. This looks like part of the original road. Notice how large the stones are on the left and the right, and also what this man's walking on. This is Jonathan, the leader of our group. And so not exactly like cobblestone, smooth surface or anything like that. Back to the front part where you move up to the edge of the area, you'll notice there's a wall in front of you where you can walk up to, and right at the edge of this wall is a little elevation there. And if you get up closer to it, well, let's back up. I forgot now which way I had these pictures set up. Come on, picture. If you get up close to it, you can see that there's some small pillar-like things. It looks like something was either burning incense inside it or a pillar was built on it out on the front corners. And the reason is that this is where the men would sit at the city gates to discuss the affairs of life or of God or of the town itself. And so discussion in Ruth chapter 4 that Boaz goes up to the gate and he takes 10 men, the elders of the city, and he sits down there and they have a discussion. You remember what the discussion was about? When Boaz goes up to the city gate. He's looking for a wife. Her name is Ruth. And in front of everybody else, he says to her next of kin person, "Are you going to marry Ruth?" And he says no. He says, "Well, I would like to barter with you and get this arrangement because of such and such." And so this is one of the traditions that the men had in sitting at the city gates. And you find that they are kind of like a legal system that's set up there, that when you're doing something in front of them, it's addressed in front of reputable people of stature within the city that thereby would affirm that what you have done or transpired, some legal exchange, it might be buying property, it might be buying animals or whatever, is done before these men. 2 Samuel 19 talks about, and a king arose and sat at the gate before the people came before the king. Now the next picture here. This is a closer shot, and you can see the pieces of stoneware here and here. Either something was in the stones or a column sitting on top of it, and then something in the back side of it too. And it looks perfectly set up for where a large chair can be placed for a king to sit at the gate, just like they have pictured there. Part of the city wall, just at the edge. Another piece that was discovered recently in the area of Dan is called the Tel Dan Stela, I believe it's pronounced. The inscription on it talks about the house of David. This is the first archaeological evidence of King David. It's not the first evidence, the Bible would be that, but it's an archaeological piece. It's by an Armenian king who erected the stela in the mid-8th century BC and claims to have defeated the, quote, king of Israel, the king of the house of David. There's a claim that he makes, but this is on a piece now that is in the museum there in Israel. And so I had to borrow this picture from the internet because we didn't have one to take it because they took the piece with them. But it was found right there at the gates, right around this area. Let's see. More luck somewhere around this area, just right as you're coming up to the gate. Like he'd made some proclamation of how great he was. Okay. Another archaeological proof, just reaffirming what we already knew and believed about the life of David. I've said before, but just reminding us that the more science pursues excellence in different areas, the more the archaeologists dig in areas in trying to expose the Bible not being true, the more evidence they keep finding that verifies that the Bible is exactly what it has been saying the whole time through, and proving that those things that were scoffed at not only did exist, but they existed exactly where God's words had proclaimed them. Case in point would be the discussion in the book of Acts. And some people that had gone through the area and gone to these cities that were scoffed at, that they said didn't exist, and they find that they did. And archaeologists discovering, the more they dug, the more they found cities and kings, etc., that they thought didn't exist actually being there. And this is just another part here. Reference to 2 Kings 23:8 talks about one of the latter kings, I believe it might have been Jeroboam. It said he defiled the high places where the priest had burned incense, and he broke down the high places at the gates. And so right outside of the city gate where we just had that one picture, just in that area, is a structure more like an altar or whatever, and then piles of stones on top of it, where it looks as to be the area where they burn animal sacrifices. This is not within the city. it was not an altar that was designated by God. But right here, reference from 2 Kings, talking about the high places now that are being used to defame God's name. Inside the city era is a place where the high priest actually offered sacrifices. The metal frame was placed up there later, but you can see the structure around it so well, perfectly laid out, squared off, and the middle section around where the frame is thought to be where the high priest actually would come in and burn the sacrifices. There are stands, etc., where we were sitting and looking down on this. So it was set up in an arena fashion to some degree where people could look down and see the sacrifices that are being, not like the temple that has a Holy of Holies, but this is an area where sacrifices were burned and people could come and see. Leviticus 16 talks about taking a censer full of burning coals from the altar before the Lord to carry them and transport them to another part. And this is the area where they feel like the censer, coals, etc., were brought to be placed in the censer. I mentioned this last week, I believe it was, but right in that very same area, just a little bit north of where we were looking at as far as Dan is concerned, is Mount Hermon, the largest or the tallest mountain, as they call it, in this area, and thought to be the possible site of the Transfiguration because of where Jesus was when it says he left this area, Caesarea, and then he went to a large mountain that very near Caesarea and Dan are near together. Then it moves up above that where the cities existed, where Mount Hermon is, and they think that's, I see flickering, where that is. Okay. Mount Arbel. We're moving now from Dan, where we were looking at up here, down to alongside the Sea of Galilee. Mount Arbel is not on this map, but the arrow is pointing to an area about where that would be located. Mount Arbel is a place where a lot of the Jews tried to escape persecution. I remember when Rome came in and destroyed Jerusalem, that their target were the Jewish people. We forget, thinking about the Christian persecution, that in a certain time period, the Jews were also persecuted. And so they scattered about, and one of the locations that they went to was around Mount Arbel, not too far away from the Jerusalem area, and would be hiding out in caves for safety. Pardon? Were they being put to death for what they believed in? Yes. They pursued them to destroy them. They were the enemy as far as they were concerned. Recall that the Jewish nation is more than just a religion. It is a nation, and it is a nation with armies, and it is a nation that conquers. And so the people that were looking to conquer them wanted to destroy their enemies. And there's a religious feeling, I'm sure, in there too, as far as hatred and all is concerned. So on top of Mount Arbel is a slab. I never did quite understand what it said. Obviously, the reason is because I don't read any of those three languages, but it looks to be the part where it's being dedicated because you're looking down to the caved areas. Now, they look like small little dots around this area here, but you can look off and see the cave areas where these people had hidden themselves during the persecution. There's a lot of people that suffered during this time. You look to another direction off of Mount Arbel, and it overlooks the Sea of Galilee. Again, Remember the arrow that pointed across the sea to that. So beautiful area. It's probably described in the internet as one of the best locations to look down on the Sea of Galilee. Looking off to another direction, there's a city called Tiberias, and it's one of the best areas around Galilee area as far as growth and prosperity, etc., even to the time of Christ. King Tiberius was the emperor during the time of Jesus Christ. Questions? The next part, I think we shift gears, yes, to Magdala. So I'm going to stop right there. Got a few minutes yet. Interesting? It's hard for me to fathom before standing there and even listening to the guides and the one who is from Kentucky, member of the church, who's done a lot of study. He's scholared in several different areas. He's a podiatrist, younger guy, just excellence in so many different things. But he talked about these things, and I would look at the area where we walked up to it, and it looked so modern as far as Dan and that mud front entrance. And he said, this is where Abraham came. And I looked at it and thought, location-wise, this is the wall Abraham saw. And I'm thinking, this wall, this is where Abraham came. This is where he had to go in. This is what he had to do. And the locations where the Jews would be hiding out was a little easier to picture because there were caves. But the vision is something that is well over 3,000 years old. When we look at antiques being 150 to 200 years old here, our building, we think is an older building because it dates back to 1924 when this building was erected. And the other day I was around the Gatlinburg area and I was looking at, in Caves Cove, some buildings that were old church buildings, and it was like 1839. And people are going, wow, that's old. I'm thinking, I'm looking at where Abraham has been, and it was 1,800 years before Christ. And we're looking at the building still being there, at least the front of the temple, the front of the actual structure, the wall and all, the gate. And it's hard to think in terms of centuries ago, as in 1800s years ago, or 2,000 and 1,800 years ago, how those things can still exist, and yet they do. And it's just confirming that all that we're reading in this book that is so old, coming from manuscripts that date back not that far, but quite a distance back, as in 2,000 years ago, some of them a little older, depending on what manuscripts, some of them younger, are true and are real, and are speaking of the reality of God and His message. Those things did happen, and they're still there. And all we have to do is just dig around a bit, and there they were. Magdala. I'm excited to get to talk about this place. Magdala, if you'll remember the second map that we saw, the arrow that went across the Sea of Galilee, is on the west coast. It's a small town. It's north to south, kind of halfway down the Sea of Galilee. Sea of Galilee is not that big. Remember, it's 15 miles long. So, about 5 miles down from the northern section is this town called Magdala. Magdala was in existence in the time of Christ. There's a person who is Mary Magdalene. She's from Magdala. There's discussion about Jesus in the area of Magdala. this is a discovery of a first century synagogue. It almost looks like a sketch, but what you're looking at is an aerial view in 2009 when some multi-millionaire just put out the money, I think from a Catholic church. I believe it might have had a Mexican background. I don't remember the details, pardon me for that. But to have the excavations done. And so with the enormous amount of money, they were able to start digging. If you could consider the roof not being there, the structure and the blocks, etc., below are part of the synagogue of Magdala that dates back to the first century. And you're going, well, how can you date a rock? You know, I mean, you go to the driveway, you pick up a rock. Is that a rock that's 10 years old? Is that a rock that's 2,000 years? Where did it come from? How did it get here? And all of these things. And so I've been there, I've just scoffed at it and wondered about how all these different things. Once again, the size of the stones help you a bit in the dating. In the archaeologist's discovery, you see the guy on the left with his hands out as he's talking to these people, and he's discussing this stone right here at his feet, which looks just like this one. This is a replica. We took a picture of. This is the photograph that was taken the day that they're bringing in all the newspaper people, et cetera, to have a discussion about the most recent discoveries in Magdala. And so, and this is an important one. We'll just mention that it relates to reading the scrolls and text, et cetera, on the synagogue floor. And I'll leave it at that for next week here. The reason that they know that this synagogue dates back to it is because a couple artifacts that they'd found have the stamp on some of the coins of the Emperor Tiberius on it, who lived during the time of Christ. So when you're digging through, carefully pulling up pieces, and you pick up coins in the debris that date to that time, you know that you're finding it going back to that period, at least. Could have been even later than that, but at least it existed during that time. If you uncover something in your yard and you pull up a coin, you see a coin that says 1900, you go, something happened here, at least around 1900. Could have been back before that and the coin got dropped there and it was just an older coin. But you see how the coin specifically gives you a definite time date reference that you would even trust more than you would the rocks, which also date to that time. So the Magdala stone is something that's important. It's in the Jewish museum, the original one. I have the replica that looks just like this one, and we'll talk a little more about it next week. And that is the end of our lesson. I hope that go back and see in your concordance some references about Magdala and see what we're going to look at next week, Lord willing. Okay? Time for the bell, so we'll pause here for a station break, as they say on TV. We'll have a prayer, and then we'll pick back up in 15 minutes. Father, we bow before you this morning, and we consider your greatness. We look back over time, and we think in time references of thousands of years, and it's so hard to ponder. And yet, at the very beginning of it all, you were there bringing about all of these things, and you watched each event take place and all the things that happened. Help what we've looked at today to encourage our hearts and strengthen us in our faith toward what's written in your word, and put a firmer trust in it in every way. You are God, and you are great.